New historical criticism. So we're going to explore a critical technique that arose from a department outside of the English department. Like so many other techniques that we've looked at, this one, not surprisingly, comes from historians. The new historical movement grew from as a way of looking at literature by looking at its place within kind of culture in a broader context. Now, there is an old historical way of looking at literature, as we might recall, and this was a way of like really kind of exploring like the author's background and family life and what made them think a certain way, and trying to get at the real intent of the author by looking at all of this biographical information. And that was kind of discounted by the new critics, right? By the early American formalists, and they kind of like walked away from all of that and left it like far back in the dust for many years. And then in the intervening years, like a variety of different ways of looking at literature came up, like kind of like born from deconstruction. Once you have deconstruction in the picture, then you're able to kind of build up literature in different contexts and examine it, not for necessarily what it's intending to do, but how it actually operates on society. You have Marxism that developed out of economics, and you have psychoanalysis that developed out of psychology. Well, along come the historians, and they kind of do the same sort of thing. And historians like Stephen Greenblatt wanted to look at literature in relation to the work that led up to that literature, the cultural work, the cultural environment that led up to that literature, and the work the literature does to culture. Okay, so you have this kind of central point, right, where you have this timeline where you have the literature here as something that's being created, and there are all of these different cultural factors that lead into the creation of this work, and then from on the other side, these impacts of the work itself, which is really kind of an interesting way of looking at literature. Now, you can look at literature written in any period through a new historical lens, but a lot of the work in New Historicism relates to the English Renaissance, and this is because Stephen Greenblatt and some of the other like early scholars in the field were specialists in Elizabethan literature. And so, authors like Shakespeare and John Donne were explored to great detail, right? So how do you get at this? How do you look at the culture that leads into a work and how the work impacts culture? As you might imagine, in order to understand the way culture impacts the creation of a work, you need to look at what's going on, documents that support what's going on before the work is created, right? Things that might have impacted the culture of the time and might have impacted the author's thinking as they were creating this work, right? And that might and gives us a better understanding of the circumstances that led to the production of the literature. There are all kinds of different factors that you might look into. If you're reading Shakespeare, you might look into what's going on with colonialism at the time, right? How did this impact his thinking in relation to a work, to any of his works, right? You might look into a lot of his plays were historical. You might look into the historical documents that he used when he was doing research so that you could better understand his understanding of literature, which was kind of a common, which is a common way that Shakespeare was examined. Hollingshead was one of his main sources. There was a writer called Hollingshead, an historian. And a lot of new historical critics have looked at Hollingshead in order to better understand Shakespeare. There's kind of this triangulation. There are a couple of different types of triangulation that occurs. There's kind of a triangulation. One of the kinds of triangulation is a triangulation of documents at the time of the inception of the literature. Okay, so you might say, oh, okay, here's a record of, of something that seems relevant to this, a record of maybe a church record, or maybe whatever, some kind of contemporary record. And then here's a history, and then here's another, maybe even another story or another poem or another play, right? And here is a treaty that happened at the time, or here's a speech that was given, or whatever, right? So you take these different sources and you kind of like demonstrate the relationships between each other and to the text itself. And in doing that, you create an understanding of the cultural circumstances that led to that work. Why it was that author must have created the work they created, why they had to, right? What was going on and why it was shaped the way that it was. Now, on the other side, as you might imagine, if you want to show the impact that a work had on culture, again, you have to find more documents, right? Where you're exploring different documents that came out of that. If they directly refer to it, great, that's really good evidence. If they don't, but you can see how they might have been impacted by the work, that's really interesting too. And you can construct an argument around all of this. Needless to say, that's a ton of work, right? And so the new historical critics are known for their kind of scholarly diligence, which is kind of interesting. Now, they're not just interested in what happened at the time. And they make this kind of a couple of interesting conceits. One of them is that we can never really understand what happened at the time. We no matter how hard we try, we can never become a Renaissance English person. Right? Never. It's just impossible. We can't think like somebody from the Renaissance because we don't have that full experience. We can understand it. We strive to, right? That's part of the model. That's what we're how we're doing all that early triangulation, right? But we can't fully understand it, and because of that, we must concede that the meaning of a work changes over time. Remember, one of the things that we're looking at is the impact of the work on culture. That doesn't mean that we're just limiting ourselves to the impact of the work on the culture, like within 5 years following it or whatever. Like, we're interested in the ongoing transformation of culture as a result of the work. So how has Shakespeare changed the way we think, and how do we change what Shakespeare means, right? So our own cultural contexts are also really important. And then another kind of important conceit that they make is that there is no such thing as objectivity, right? That there are no objective truths, no objective facts, that everything is the result of a lens that we look through it from. And so, like, we can't say, I mean, even a historical record, right? If you think about a historical record, who wrote the records? What information did they leave in? What information did they leave out? If objectivity existed and could be stated, right? Then the history would not be an art of trying to understand, but it would simply be a matter of pushing play on a recording that was perfectly clear, right? And I think we can all agree that it's not that. You've heard the phrase "history was written by the winners." Well, history was written by the people who wrote history, right? Who had their own perspectives and their own viewpoints and their own, even if they weren't politically motivated, which a lot of them were, they were impacted by their own biases. And this is perfectly supported by the new historical model, right? Which wants to which looks at a piece of literature and says, oh, okay, what were the things that influenced the author into thinking that was the way they needed to express themselves? they would ask themselves the same thing of somebody trying to be objective. What were the historical factors that led them to think that it was objectively correct? Wrongly, right? Now, one other kind of important point that I'd like to make about this is that to the new historicists, literature wasn't the only thing you could read as literature. You can look at any of the documents in the same lens. So if you're looking at it new historically, right, pulling together these different materials and these different sources and seeing their relationships and trying to describe the work of them, you can do that with any of the documents you're looking at. You can do that with a simple like census list, right? And you can look at it as a work of literature, because your goal here isn't necessarily to critique the aesthetics of the piece, but rather to look at the work society did on it and the work it does on society, and those are the kind of principal ideas of new historicism. Oh, I mentioned a couple of different types of triangulation. Well, so you triangulate the stuff that is contemporary to the piece, both going in and coming out. Then you also triangulate the material that is contemporary to us or to different interpreters, right? You can look at any time period and the importance of a work to that time period. I might take let's move away from the Renaissance for a second. I might take a Victorian work like Alice in Wonderland, right? And do a whole exploration of what led to the creation of that work, and like contemporary documents and that sort of thing, the impact that work had on later Victorian culture. And then I might look at it and say, hey, I've noticed that in the 1960s there was a real fascination. There were songs like White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. There was a real fascination with Alice in Wonderland, that there's something about the kind of surreal quality to it, like caught the imaginations of people who were doing psychedelic drugs, and so it had a whole different like meaning to them. It had a whole different factor in the way that it was read, and it had an impact on their culture. And then I can do that with today too. So there's all kinds of like material being looked at against one another and in relation to one another. And I guess that's what I mean by many ways of triangulating. So it's a really fascinating way to explore literature, and that's kind of it in a nutshell.